Rick Harrison had seen fortunes hidden inside dusty paintings, forgotten trunks, military relics, and family heirlooms that had sat untouched for decades. After years behind the counter, he believed very little could still surprise him. Every strange object came with a story, and every story usually ended the same way. Either the owner expected far too much, or the item turned out to be worth far less than anyone hoped. Experience had taught him to stay calm no matter what appeared through the front door. Then one ordinary afternoon, something happened that challenged everything he thought he knew about rare artifacts. The bell above the entrance gave its familiar ring as a man stepped inside carrying an old wooden crate with both hands. He wasn't smiling like someone expecting a payday, nor did he look nervous enough to think he was carrying something priceless. Instead, there was hesitation in the way he walked, as if the object inside the crate carried memories heavier than its actual weight. He carefully rested the box on the counter and introduced himself as David. "This belonged to my grandfather," he explained quietly. "He served in the Pacific during World War II. After he came home, this was packed away in an old duffel bag. It's been sitting in our family ever since." Rick nodded. Stories like that were common. Thousands of American servicemen had returned from the Pacific Theater with souvenirs collected during the war. Some were ordinary military equipment. Others were ceremonial swords, medals, uniforms, or pieces of Japanese craftsmanship that had survived generations inside attics and basements. Most turned out to be interesting. Very few turned out to be extraordinary. David admitted that he'd finally become curious the night before. After browsing online, he found similar samurai helmets selling anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000. "I figured if that's true," he said, "it would help pay off some bills." Rick smiled politely. "If it's genuine," he replied, "that's definitely possible." He lifted the lid from the crate. The room became strangely quiet. Resting inside was a Japanese kabuto, a traditional samurai helmet, but it looked unlike most examples Rick had encountered. Its deep black lacquer still reflected light despite centuries of age. Gold trim framed the edges with remarkable precision. The crescent-shaped crest rising from the front wasn't decorative sheet metal. It appeared hand-forged, every curve carrying tiny hammer marks left by an artisan who had shaped it hundreds of years earlier. Rick leaned closer. The silk cords connecting the layered neck guard remained remarkably intact. That immediately caught his attention. Organic materials like silk rarely survived several centuries without extensive restoration. Yet these cords appeared original. He gently lifted the helmet. It felt heavier than expected. Not physically, historically. Years spent handling antiques had given Rick an instinct he trusted. Occasionally, before an expert ever spoke, before paperwork confirmed authenticity, something simply felt different. This felt different. He slowly rotated the helmet beneath the shop lights. The iron plates weren't molded together in later manufacturing styles. Instead, dozens of individual pieces had been painstakingly riveted by hand. Tiny imperfections revealed human craftsmanship impossible to duplicate through modern mass production. Rick's expression changed. "What is it?" David asked. Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and removed the magnifying glass he reserved for objects demanding closer attention. Customers recognized that magnifying glass. Whenever Rick reached for it, everyone nearby instinctively leaned forward. It usually meant something important was happening. He examined the lacquer. No obvious restoration. He inspected the rivets. Consistent aging. The crescent crest. Authentic wear. Finally, he turned the helmet upside down. Near the interior base sat several markings pressed into the iron. Rick frowned. He didn't recognize them. That bothered him. After handling historical weapons and armor from around the world, unfamiliar markings were unusual. He studied them again. Still nothing. For several long moments, the pawn shop became almost silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Finally, Rick placed the helmet back onto the counter with exceptional care. "I'm going to need a little time," he said. David looked concerned. "Is something wrong?" "No," Rick replied slowly. "If anything, Something might be very right. Before making another move, Rick asked a question. Did your grandfather leave anything else with this? David thought for a moment. I think there might have been some papers. What kind of papers? I'm not sure. They're written in Japanese. Rick looked up immediately. Where are they? In my truck. Would you mind grabbing them? David hurried outside while Rick continued studying the helmet. As soon as the door closed behind him, Rick found himself thinking about everything he knew regarding Japanese armor. Most samurai helmets that reached Western collections came from the Edo period. Those pieces were beautiful. Rare examples regularly sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Exceptional ones sometimes reached into six figures. But every now and then, a much older piece surfaced. Artifacts from Japan's Sengoku period, the violent century of constant warfare before the nation united, were vastly different. They weren't ceremonial decorations. They were battlefield survivors. Helmets from that era had witnessed legendary campaigns, shifting alliances, and battles that shaped an entire civilization. Very few remained in private hands. Even fewer carried identifiable family connections. Rick glanced again at the mysterious markings. Something about their style reminded him of early clan insignias he'd seen years earlier in museum catalogs. Not identical, just similar enough to raise questions. David returned carrying a clear plastic sleeve. Inside rested several folded pages filled with elegant handwritten Japanese characters. Rick carefully unfolded one. He couldn't read a single word, but age leaves clues beyond language. The paper showed uneven fiber patterns typical of traditional handmade sheets. The ink had faded naturally into the fibers instead of sitting on the surface like modern reproductions. Even without translation, it looked old. Very old. Rick's heartbeat quickened. He knew enough not to jump to conclusions. Authentic-looking documents could still be forged. Family stories could become exaggerated across generations. Internet myths had fooled countless collectors. But instinct told him this discovery deserved more than assumptions. He picked up his phone. There was only one person he trusted with something like this. One of America's leading specialists in Japanese arms and armor. If anyone could separate fantasy from history, it would be him. Rick made the call. I need you down here. There was a brief pause. It's important. He looked once more at the silent helmet resting beneath the lights. For the first time that afternoon, Rick wasn't thinking about buying it. He was wondering whether he had just uncovered a piece of history that wasn't supposed to exist. If you found an old crate in your family's attic, would you open it immediately? Or would you leave it untouched, afraid of what you might discover? Let us know in the comments. Because what happened after the expert walked through those doors would leave everyone inside the pawn shop completely speechless. The specialist arrived nearly 2 hours later. There was nothing flashy about his entrance. No dramatic introduction, no lengthy greeting. He simply walked through the front door carrying a small leather case that looked more like a doctor's bag than something belonging to a historian. Rick met him halfway across the shop. I'm glad you came. If you sounded this serious on the phone, the expert replied, I assumed it couldn't wait. The helmet was already sitting beneath the brightest light in the shop. Without another word, the expert slipped on a pair of white cotton gloves and gently lifted the kabuto from the counter. The entire room fell silent. Rick had watched countless experts inspect antiques over the years, but there was always a rhythm to their work. Most examined an item for a few minutes before offering an opinion. This was different. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The expert hadn't spoken a single sentence. Instead, he rotated the helmet a few degrees at a time, photographing every angle with a high-resolution camera before switching to a magnifying loupe. Every rivet, every silk cord, every layer of lacquer received careful attention. David stood quietly beside Rick. Neither man wanted to interrupt. The silence itself was becoming part of the mystery. Next came a small ultraviolet light. As its faint purple glow crossed the helmet's surface, hidden details suddenly appeared within the lacquer. Certain repairs that modern restorers often left behind simply weren't there. The finish appeared astonishingly consistent. If restoration had ever been performed, it had been almost impossible to detect. The expert then examined the crescent-shaped crest attached to the front. He traced its edges with one gloved finger. "This wasn't cast," he finally murmured. Rick leaned closer. It was forged. Only 3 words. But Rick understood their significance.